So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Behler, the play-by-play voice of the Boise State Broncos. Bob, how about a wave for everybody? So just in case they can't read your name or know who you are. Mark Boyle, voice of the Indiana Pacers on the radio. Mark, good morning.
Good morning.
Matt Krause, the women's basketball voice of the North Carolina Tar Heels, and still doing stuff with Elon, Matt?
Yes, football pre-half and post in color with Wes's brother Taylor.
There you go. Everything's related in this business, isn't it? And John Rooke, play-by-play voice of the Providence Friars basketball team, also the public address announcer of everyone's favorite NFL team, your New England Patriots. So we'll start with Bob, who's in the upper left.
Excuse me.
Yes, Mr. Durham.
I like John just as much as everybody else. You know.
I just hired Dave as my agent. So.
Nope, we have somebody trying to. All right, so let's start with Bob, and if you would, Bob, your highlights of how to prepare for play-by-play as you make your way toward game day or game time.
I'm going to start with a little bit with football. I know we've got John and Mark that do a lot of basketball. I do some basketball too out here at Boise State. But I always start my preparation during the week on Sunday leading up to a Saturday football game. And I really start with the team that you're going to be playing because you're more familiar with your own team. So I will spend the early part of the week building my spotting board and really focusing Sunday, Monday, Tuesday on what I'm going to see from the other team. And I start by building my spotting board, and I don't trust the depth charts that I've been getting in the last, say, 5 to 10 years from the other team. So I kind of make my own. And I do it by looking at their stats, seeing how many games somebody has started. I kind of look at also what number of tackles, say, on the defensive side, because sometimes you'll see people not listed in a depth chart that somehow find their way into the statistics. And sometimes teams don't change their depth chart until maybe a week or two later when maybe they all of a sudden decided they want to list somebody as a starter. I'll go and look at a couple of games early, kind of look to see who they have out there, and then kind of compare what I have with their depth charts that somebody has given you versus what's playing. And then I kind of make my own based on what I've seen. So as I make stickers for each of the players, I'll put different things in the boxes so that as I'm doing the game, if I want to look down at something from the other teams, that I have it right in front of me. And then as the week moves along, I'll add different things that I hear. I'll try to watch about 3 games leading up to each game of the team that we're going to see. Announcers on television always get some good stuff, so you can jot some things down about the different players. And the thing that I always like to remember is that when you're doing a game, people in your market don't know anything usually about the other team or don't know nearly as much as they know about your team. So you can kind of go to the Cliff Notes version for them, but it becomes a lot more difficult to come up with new and interesting things about your own team. So later in the week, especially after we've recorded our coaches show on Wednesday night, is the time that I usually try to focus in on getting some information, writing things down for the team that I broadcast, Boise State. And then Friday night, the night before the game, I'll write down a lot of different things on a legal pad that I want to get in during the game, and then I'll have it sitting there with me so that if I want to look down at something, it's sitting there fresh for me, easy for me to see. I write things. I know a lot of people use computers, but for me, when I write something down, I have a tendency to remember it more than if something that I've typed. So you'll see my spotting boards are handwritten. A lot of different colors mean different things to me. If you'll see a number, just a number in brown, that's a career number. If you'll see a number in green on my board, you'll know that that's a season number. So I don't have to write a lot of different things like, what year, whether it was last year or this year. I have my own system with colors. So, but again, I try to start with the other team first part of the week, and then move to, cleaning things up and doing things with the Boise State team later in the week.
Bob, thank you very much. Let's move over now to Mark Boyle. Mark?
Well, I would say some of the same things that we just heard. The NBA is a little different because we play multiple games each week. So the way I do it is it's a 3-tiered process for me. I'm always following the league. And so every day I go on to my preferred websites to see what's happening around the league, just to make sure I have a general level of knowledge about the league in general. And then the second level of preparation for me is I tend to start focusing on our opponents 1 week out. So generally I'm looking at 3 or 4 teams at a time, just keeping a little bit closer eye on what they're doing, looking at newspapers, maybe making a call or two. And then my primary focus is on whomever the next opponent is. But like all of you guys, I have stuff that's generic in nature that I'm just adding to all the time. When I say preparing, it's not a start from scratch process every game. I have plenty of stuff already that I'm adding to. I too have a sheet that I keep with me with bullet points on it that I may or may not get in. And I don't know how many younger guys are on with us, Dave, but I will say one thing about preparation that I learned early and was difficult for me. You can never, in my opinion, over-prepare, but you can over-present. So you have all this stuff, and particularly back in the day when I started, I'm as old or older than most of you. I was doing high school games in Montana. There was no internet. So any nugget that I got, damn right it's going into the broadcast. That's, for you younger fellas, that's not the way to do it. But it's good to I would guess that I use 10% of the stuff I have, but I like having it because the preparation process is valuable on 2 levels to me. Number one, it generates the information I need for the broadcast. And number 2, it just sticks stuff in my brain. It keeps me prepared. It keeps me informed. And part of that process is doing my own stuff. I'm not advocating for or against this, but I know there are sites out there that will make your charts for you and prepare your sheets. I always do my own because for me, the process of doing it helps the stuff stick with me as opposed to having somebody else do it. You still have the same info because a lot of these places are tailor made. They'll do it exactly how you want it. We all have our own sheets, and I'll just this is my spotter board that I have. I keep my own score and so forth. All of the information on the various players is in here, and I too have a color-coded system, which I won't go into here because it's very boring. But I have certain colors that indicate certain things to me, and so I know how to use it, when to use it, and in what context to use it. But I would say the difference between basketball and football, particularly at the NBA level where you've got 3 or 4 games a week, is you're just preparing on multiple levels. And preparing for me is reading. It's getting my notes together. It's updating my charts. I always try to watch at least 1 game of the next opponent before we see them, particularly if we haven't seen them in a while. The television broadcasts are very valuable from that standpoint because the TV guys are not literally doing play-by-play like the radio guys. They have a lot more freedom to share information, share knowledge, and share nuggets. So if we're playing the Sixers tomorrow and it's a Sixers-Celtics game, I always watch the Sixers telecast because I want to know more about the Sixers than the Celtics. But those are just some general things I do. I will say this for me. This is my 32nd season here, and I've been doing play-by-play since I was 19 in these Montana high schools that I mentioned. So that's 40 years for me of doing this. And I am still refining my process. I have a general way that I do things, but every once in a while, I'll take a look at somebody else's boards when we're playing another team and I say, oh, that's an interesting way to do things. Maybe I can incorporate that into my preparation. It's always an ongoing process. And I find the one key thing that helps me more than anything else is an ongoing curiosity. I want to know as much as I can about all of these people and teams. I'm curious. The day I lose the curiosity or the desire to prepare is the day that I'll know it's time for me, hopefully not to ever get a real job because I can't function there, but maybe to retire. And I don't know if I speak for the group on this, and this is my last thought on it. I enjoy the preparation almost as much as I do the broadcasts.
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We'll move now to Mr. Krause, Matt.
All right, Dave, thanks so much. So kind of going off of what Mark said, focusing on basketball, but on the college perspective, at least on the women's side in the ACC, it's very, very regimented in that you're playing Thursday and Sunday. So I'll begin my prep for 2 opponents at one time. Typically on a Monday morning, we'll look at the Thursday opponent and the Sunday opponent, and I'll go through the preliminary stages of the prep process for both opponents at once. And for me, that begins with filling out a piece of paper. Here's a template that I have for it. I call it a game sheet. Can't really see it there, but it's everything that's at stake in the course of that particular game. Because as we've all been told in this business, a broadcast is a story. So you have to be able to understand what's going on in that particular game, what's at stake, both for the teams and the individuals in the contest. Where did they come from? How did they get here to get to this point in their season? And so it's kind of the 30,000 foot view is what I call it. And so I'll start my prep by making one of those sheets for both of the games in the course of that upcoming week. And then I make my charts on the computer. I have a template for those. It's a heavily formatted Excel document here. This is just a blank template of what I use. And I've got one of those for every sport that I broadcast. And like Bob and like Mark said, there's ways to identify what's what on there. I won't go into extreme detail on it, but one of the best pieces of advice that I was given earlier on in my career from Wes, fellow Elon graduate, was that a broadcast is like an open book test, and that you have to know where the notes are when you're going into a broadcast. You don't have time to go searching for things on your board during the flow of the action, but if you know where it is, you don't have to have the exact numbers committed to them. You can just know where to find things. So like Bob and like Mark, everything is in a very specific layout here on the basketball chart. And then as the week goes along, I'm watching previous games of opponents to understand their tendencies, to understand things that their coaches have been working on, and then trying to focus on finding new things for my particular team. Because every time that you're going to tune in, you don't need to hear the same backstory on each player every time somebody's at the free throw line, or a piece of bio information just to fill time as someone's bringing the ball up the floor. So that's a challenge, to be able to find some statistical trend or something the coach said about how they're using one player or another in a different capacity in that regard. And then branching out a little bit from basketball, I do a bunch of Olympic sports in North Carolina on ACC Network Extra, the digital platform. And that prep process begins much further ahead of an event, perhaps a week or two, just because in sports like a soccer or a lacrosse, you've just got so many more players involved, and being able to tell the backstories and being able to identify the players in a television style broadcast requires so much more storytelling than in a radio setting. So that's a prep process that's going to be 1 to 2 weeks longer than the more regimented radio prep process when I'm calling games on a team radio network.
Thank you, Matt. And now let's go to John Rooke. John?
Dave, thanks. First of all, appreciate your doing this. It's great to see so many familiar names and faces that I've had a pleasure to work with over the years. Bob Behler, we had our time at ESPN for a while, and Dave Sims, Eric Reid, all these guys, John Morris, good to see you guys. I've been doing this in the Big East now for 32 seasons, in the NFL for 29 years, and I feel like there's hardly a day goes by that I don't know that I'm blessed to do what I do. I like to think that I really, in fact, I even tell my students this on occasion, there's not a day in my life that I've ever really worked. I've only really just enjoyed doing what I do. And Mark Boyle brought out something a couple of moments ago. I enjoy the prep almost as much as I enjoy doing the games themselves. And I guess it comes back from being a failed athlete so many years ago, because I wanted to be involved with it all. And that's really kind of where I kind of stand with it. There are some things that I think each one of our guys have brought up here that I know that rings true with a lot of you guys who want to do games and are doing games and have done them at a very high level for a very long time. So I'll just touch on a few separate things that go into my preparing. I do try to watch as many games live as I can, much to the chagrin of my family through the years in dominating the television, I think, as everybody probably understands. But I feel like, watching a game live, and by that I mean also through television, if you can't get to the game, allows you to pick up on the nuances of a game. For instance, I mean, I know that shoot-arounds rarely happen anymore in the NBA, Mark. Having done that many years ago myself, they turn into just, basic, you don't get much accomplished in those sessions. But a shoot-around in college basketball sometimes is important, especially if you haven't spent a lot of time, I think, with your own team. And so I always try to go in an effort to see some of the things that a team might be inputting for that game that night or the next day whenever they have a practice. And I think it's important to kind of understand principles so you can recognize that, and it will help you in your call when you're trying to create that picture for your audience. Now, and as far as, our teams, as we cover our teams, clearly, like so many others, I try to spend the majority of my time working on the opponents because you just don't know them as well as you know your own team. You spend a lot of time with your team. During the course of a 5 or 6 month college basketball season, you basically live with a bunch of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. So it takes me right back to the frat house, believe me, in a lot of instances. But you know your own team, and yet you try to learn something about the other team that maybe nobody else knows. I always go into a broadcast, and I tell my college students this as well. I always go into a broadcast trying to come up with something maybe that someone did not know. Maybe I didn't know, but I always try to do my research in that regard. And as far as my pages and my charts are concerned, my cheat notes, my cheat sheets, whatever you have, certainly it's not quite as thorough, I think, when you're working on these things for your own team. But I'm going to see, Dave, if the share screen option will work here, rather than just hold it up. I'm going to share with, see if I can come up. I don't know if this will work or not here, Big Dave. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, got it.
This is actually my game sheet from the game that got canceled because of the coronavirus pandemic in New York. This was the first game that was due up after we got the plug pulled on us at Madison Square Garden on March 13th. And actually, was it March 13th, March 12th, somewhere around there? This was our game with Butler. And so this is my sheet. I styled it largely after an old NCAA scorebook. When I first started out doing this back in the 1980s, I wanted to keep track of score. A lot of guys don't like to keep track of scores and the like throughout the course of a game because they concentrate on what's going on the floor. I've always felt that it keeps me more involved in the game and the broadcast if I can keep up with some very basic numbers. Who scored a field goal, who hit the free throw, the fouls that are occurred, things along those lines. I don't keep a running score per se. Usually when I was doing college football, and I did college football for over 20 years, I would keep a drive chart. So that way I could always go back and refer to things as quickly as I needed when you're resetting or you're recapping, which is always important for us to do for our audiences, because as we know in radio is an extraordinarily transient audience. You don't know when somebody's going to pop in and pop back out again. In basketball, it's almost a little different, but I always like, rather than now today, you have a computer monitor that sometimes will allow you, and stat programs that will allow you to pick up numbers and stats from time to time. I never wanted to depend on a computer. Maybe that's just old school me and my way of thinking. But I like to be able to glance down at my sheet and say, hey, Kamar Baldwin at Butler, has a heck of a game going. He's got 24 points. That's the kind of guy that, you could expect that from. So this is my opponent game sheet from what we did. And largely it shows basic numbers, basic stats, basic color schemes. Largely, guys, I appreciate the different colors that you guys were talking about earlier. Hey, I just like pretty lights, As long as it gets me to focus on one part of my sheet when I glance down at it, there is no real reason for the color or the scheme or whatever. I'm sort of attracted to the light, like bugs, to the zapper, out on the back patio. But that's kind of what I do. And so usually if there's a number that like leads the conference or is extraordinarily significant, I'll put a little bit of a shade on it or put it in a different color just so I can kind of grab my attention to it. And as you can see from the sheet that I use here, most of it is basic, with the exception of some of the stats from conference play, their high scores. And then the two first half and second half columns, that's, if a guy hits a bucket, I'll put a 2 down. If he hits a 3, I hit the 3. If he goes 1 for 2 at the foul line, that's usually a circle with an X through it. And if it's a 1-and-1, it's a line at the top. If it's a 2-shot foul, it's a line at the bottom. Different ways of doing it, but it helps me keep track of things and helps me try to tell the story just a little bit better. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea. I'm happy to share share with anybody that wants it, a template of the sheets that I use. Like I said, it comes from an old NCAA scorebook that I adapted over the years, not only to do the college basketball I do, but when I was doing the NBA back in the 80s as well, I kind of adapted from that as well and used it along those lines. And it's a system that works for me, and I encourage everyone to find a system that you're comfortable with that helps you tell the story the best way you know how.
Great advice. And now we know that screen sharing works for everybody. So if anybody else would like to share anything, be more than happy to do that. While I have the time, we had a few new members sign up just so they could take part in this. Steve Fenig, I hope I'm saying your name right, Steve. Thank you for joining and becoming a member. Let's see who else is here. I've never had 2 screens to click back and forth with. Mike Hammett joined as a lifetime member. Mike, thank you, down in Monroe, Louisiana. Josh Tata, and I hope I'm saying it correctly. Josh, correct me, please, if I'm not. Let's see. I guess that's about it. Oh, and the newest member, actually, late last night, Max Gorin joined as a student member from North Carolina State. His dad had to pay for that, though, so there you go. It was a late birthday present. Anybody have any follow-up, any questions? We have a lot of other pros on here. Feel free just to buzz in and either ask a question or give some more insight.
I will say this, like John, anyone that wants any of my stuff, I'd be glad to share it with anybody. Just let me know and I'll email it to you or whatever.
Okay. Anybody else?
This is Neil Solons. Curious for the group because of obviously what's going on in our country. How many of you guys have done Remy type broadcasts, and how do you think that would change your preparation in terms of trying to get ready for a game? Because I think it's something as broadcasters we're all thinking about right now, about the different environment we may have to broadcast in.
I have done baseball. I've done college baseball, and Neil, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done because college baseball, unlike basketball and football, is a 3-plane game. So when you're in a studio and everybody's setup is different, I've talked to guys that, like in Boston, I think John Meter Perel's done basketball from China on a website, and I know Joe Zadaki's done some of the same type stuff. Baseball, the problem for me in baseball was the camera changes that they show you on the big monitor to the small monitors they provide. Balls hit into the outfield, you have to wait because, and Dave can probably speak to this as well as anybody. Sometimes when you're live, you got to wait on balls hit into the outfield, depending on the park you're in. But on a Remy, I got basically screwed on a ball that was hit on the inside of third base, ball that got hit into the gap. The camera angles were slow to change. I've never done a Remy football. I haven't done a Remy basketball. The 2 Remys, we did 3 Remys this year on ACC Network, and our bowl game was a Remy. I did Harvard-Yale for ESPNU, which was a Remy, but the talent was on site. But even that is a big difference. And I would tell you that I'm with you on that. I'm concerned that we're all going to be in a Remy situation here when we go back in one way or another, depending on bandwidth.
Hey, Wes and Neil, I agree with that. I think back in 2012 or 2014, the Mariners opened up the season in Japan, and we did a remote from our studios at our Root Sports Studios in just outside of Seattle. And I tell you what, the most important thing is, I think, Wes, you touched on it, wait. Don't try to be too quick because there's going to be a delay. And you just don't have the feel, the sound of the ball coming off the bat. You don't know what the atmospherics are like. You don't know what kind of, which way the wind is blowing or anything like that. So feel free, be comfortable, and being maybe a second or two behind. And I really don't think the audience is going to care really that much. But you don't want to be sitting there pounding yourself like, what the heck did I do that for? Take your time. There's no rush. Nobody, if they're sticking with you on this broadcast, they're going to watch you. And if you're a couple of seconds behind, nobody's going to care. And so with that, having said that, it'll help you relax. Trust me. Because I know the first couple innings, I was trying to do the normal, being right with it. And I said, this is not working. Wave them off.
I would say this, I've done basketball and hockey via remote. The preparation is the same because you're doing the same thing. You're broadcasting a game. But the thing that I found difficult, and I didn't do enough of it to get totally comfortable with it, I just didn't feel as engaged as I was when I was in the building.
Right.
Now, we piped in crowd noise and all of that, so that was helpful. But you're still sitting in a studio. You're at the mercy of what's on the screen. Now, in basketball, it's not like Dave described or Wes with the baseball. Basketball, I would think, is probably one of the easier ones to do via remote, but it's a mindset, or at least it was for me. And as I said, I didn't do enough of it to get comfortable, but I had a really hard time getting engaged. And that's an issue because I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know. You've got to be engaged. It's critical. And I just didn't really feel engaged in a studio. And like the rest of you, I'm concerned about going into studios, but long term, and I'm old enough so that I might not be around forever, but my real concern is this. Once they see that it can be done in a studio, then we're going to be in a studio all the time because it's all about money and it's all about finances. So if I were going to give anyone any advice, especially the younger guys, you better prepare and you better get ready to learn how to do it in a studio because I think it's coming.
I would, Neil, the only thing I would add, and this goes to any Remy, and I think that I've had this from guys who've done Remy basketball. Mark might be able to speak to this. You've got to have a pretty good relationship with whoever the director is going to be, especially when it comes to basketball and football, because typically in basketball, they really rarely show the officials making the call.
Yeah.
So I know that ESPNU had some problems when they started doing Remy basketball, and I shouldn't say ESPNU. That's where most of them aired. They did 200 and some Remys a year ago, and a lot of the problems constitute from what is actually transpired, let's say on a foul call or, in baseball, if, there's an interference play or something like that, I would just suggest you have somebody speed dialed on text or something so you can get some clarity. Because that's the biggest question that ends up coming back out of basketball is what happened? What did they call? They had a situation 2-3 years ago with an ESPNU broadcast where they called a shot clock violation in a 1-point game, or it was a shot clock violation, and they called a 3-second call. On TV, they said it was 3 seconds, and in reality, it was a shot clock violation. Yeah. So the whole dynamic of the call confused the viewer when in reality everybody in the building was fine with it. Had they been on site, they would have known. To me, the officiating is, and Mark may feel differently, to me, the officiating is the biggest differential you're going to face, whether it's baseball, basketball. If there's a targeting call in a football game, I have no idea what that transaction would be like for somebody in a Remy situation.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Wes said there, and I will make one other observation about that. We went through it when they moved us, as they have now in almost every building, off the floor and up into the rafters. Some places are better than others. I had a real hard time with this from a mental perspective. There's just no way, and this will be amplified in a studio, I think. There's just no way you're not going to make more mistakes. You just are. And it's really difficult to come to grips with because I'm sure all of you take great pride in what you're doing. You don't like to make mistakes. And I speak for myself when I say, I make enough on my own. I don't need someone's help to make more. If you're going to make more, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, I agree with that. When I was doing Westwood 1 games and I was used to being on the floor during the NCAA tournament, And then I remember a couple of regular season games. I remember in Arizona, and I was put up in the corner about 15, 20 rows up, and it totally screwed me up. And it took me the whole half to get comfortable. And by the time I got comfortable, the game was over. And you're right, you will make some mistakes, man. You just got to keep plowing through. And like you said, some of those venues in radio, sad to say, I don't know how bad it is in the well, Mark, you can tell me about the NBA. It seems like everybody's moved up in the NBA. But, you know, some are higher and some are lower and some are up on the roof. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I'll tell you a quick story about crappy locations. In Boston, they put us in the corner now, 8 rows up, and you can't see anything.
Can't see anything, yeah.
So a few years ago, and one of the things you can't see is the corner nearest you opposite, because the basket stanchion's in the way. So several years ago, the great Joe Tate, who I'm sure you all know of or even know, had a game where he had a guy in the corner lofting up a 3, and the way Joe called it was, there's a 3 out of the corner by a player to be named later.
That's a classic Joe Tate. Classic.
Yeah, just do the best you can with your locations and come to grips with the fact that you're going to make more mistakes. It's inevitable. It's frustrating, but you can still do a good job. You just got to accept that it's a little more difficult up or from a remote studio.
You know, if I could jump in for a second, Mark, and everybody, in thinking about perhaps the NBA finishing up their season in July or August or whenever it could happen, obviously we know we're going to do remote broadcasts. And what Mark said is true. I think, you know, we're all going to feel more detached from the game we're doing than we're used to. You know, most of the time TV, we are sitting courtside. If there's a call you don't understand, you can get the referee's attention and discuss it with them. You're not going to be able to do that on a remote. The other thing I know I'm going to miss is in the NBA, one of the things they've done that's been so great for broadcasters, they stagger the time that each coach is going to speak before the game. 10 years ago, they didn't do that. Both coaches might speak at the same time. Now you can attend both coaches' pregame press conference. We always get private extra time with our coach. I'd say 70% of the time we get some extra private time with the other coach too, and that's invaluable. Of all the prep I do, that's one of the last things I add to my plate, and it's some of the stuff that you're going to see in the newspapers or online, either that night or the next day, and you've got as much sidebar material from both coaches as you can. I'm going to miss that. But the one thing I think is important to point out, and this is true all the time, especially true if we come back, you know, after this pandemic thing, is this: nobody cares about what our issues are. Think of how starved the sports fans are out there. They don't care whether we're there or doing it remotely or what frustrations we may have. So I think we're all going to have to keep that in mind, do the best we can, and remember how hungry the appetite is going to be for our games and our sports, and just make sure we keep that foremost in our mind.
Hey, Eric, to piggyback on that too, given how starved people are, I know for me, when I'm doing baseball, I go to both clubhouses every day, talk to both managers, trying to talk to as many players as possible. And I think, as Parcells would say, shopping for the groceries is going to be even more important to have more information, because you know, there's been such a void here created by the pandemic. So for me, when I go in a situation where I can get in touch with guys, I want to probably even over prepare now, because there's been just such a dearth of information, and people are looking to seize on all this stuff. I hear from Mariner fans now. I'm in New York City, for God's sake, and I'm hearing, hey, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? Who's going to be doing? So I think it's, you know, coming out of this pandemic, man, I tell you what, your preparation, I think, kick it up another couple of notches.
Agreed. Thank you, guys. Any of our younger guys on have any questions? I know there are several.
Dave.
Yes.
It's Richard Broad. I'm not all that young. I cover college and professional soccer as an analyst, which is different than most people do. And in our sport, we've rarely been afforded the luxury of a spotter. And I don't think any that I've ever had in all the broadcasts I've done have ever been helpful at all. but I know that a lot of you do rely on spotters, especially in the sport of football. And what are your guidelines for working with a spotter, and how important is that to you?
Good question. Who wants to weigh in on that?
Well, I'll give one at Boise State. We have a spotter at home that is outstanding, and I think a lot of it comes down to trust. If a lot of times if I haven't seen somebody come into a game, if somebody points on the board to somebody, I'm reluctant to call that person on the tackle because he may not have been in the game if I haven't seen him. But I trust my guy. When I've gone on the road, we used to try to find people, and I found them to be less helpful than having nobody. So on the road, most of the time, unless I have somebody I trust that I know that lives in the area, I don't go with a spotter on the road. I do it at home because we have a guy that I really trust. So I think maybe, Richard, to answer your question, I think you have to feel comfortable with who's going to be pointing it out, because if you haven't seen them make the tackle or make the block or block the field goal, you have to trust what they're pointing to if you haven't seen it. And I just don't find I can find somebody that I trust, randomly getting somebody that you don't know if you're, say, in New Mexico for the game down there.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
It's
I would
kind of
just
going
say
off of
simply-
what Bob said there. I think it's more important to have proper chemistry and hand signals and that sort of thing than it is to simply have a spotter. It's much better to have an effective one and know what's going on than to be in a spot where you're not going to have one at all, because that can just confuse you and lead to more mistakes.
I think
Yeah,
this-
the only other thing that I would add here is in traveling especially, keeping it as simple as possible. Speaking of that trust issue that Bob was talking about, for home, usually the people that you work with, you've got a certain amount of trust already built up. Plus, you're gonna know things. You're gonna be more familiar with your surroundings. When it comes to doing road games, if you're not lucky enough or fortunate enough to have someone travel with you, then a lot of times the opposing school or opposing team's staff will provide somebody from their public relations staff that could serve as a spotter. I know that's been in my case on several cases, and so I know they know their team well. So I just say, look, you spot your defense, I'll take care of the offense on both sides. And I usually just try to keep things more simple. And if I can keep it simple, that lessens the chance for incorrect information being out there, which I think is we all want to try to limit as much as we can.
Richard, I would tell you that from my perspective, the difference in a radio spotter and a TV spotter can be significant. I think the radio spotter is much more critical than the television spotter, simply because of the fifth element. You've got the visual element that exists. To me, there are okay spotters, good spotters, great spotters, and legendary spotters. And the same would apply in stats. I'm fortunate on radio with the Falcons. I have great stats and great spotter. The TV situation for me has been good, not great. The stats have actually been better than the spotting. If in football in particular, if you commit some semblance of name and number memorization, it helps you a ton. And I still am old school enough that I try and use a system to at least commit all the name and numbers of skill players and principal defensive players to memory. I'm nowhere near the ballpark my old man used to travel in doing that stuff, but I still think that's a critical piece to the whole deal. The biggest part you have now, and it's not as much on Sundays with the NFL as it is on Saturdays for me, is the constant tempo and personnel shifting that goes on in football. That part right there is brutal, because a spotter is now in college just as valuable as anybody else on the crew because the personnel changes. And more often than not, I have to tell the director about the personnel changes if it's significant. If they're running 5 on, the director kind of needs to know, and sometimes that they're running 5 different guys on offensively. And you play some teams that run anywhere from 85 to 95 plays and change 3 to 4 guys a snap if you're not careful.
You know, in my career of doing college football for about 20 years, I always felt the most difficult thing to really see, especially from football locations where you're pretty high up, is really who made the tackle. So often you're seeing the second or third guy in. And think about this, if you're doing the game on TV and you're not watching the monitor and you're just watching the field, then the viewer at home has a better view of that play than you do. So I think when you're doing TV football, a spotter is as important as your stat guy, and maybe even more so specifically for who was the first guy that really made that tackle.
Right. Agreed.
I have a question for you guys who do your spotting charts or your prep charts. John, you showed us yours looks pretty much computer generated, but you have room to make notes. I know some people prefer to handwrite their entire charts because they feel it helps up here. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, first and foremost, I did used to write mine out by hand, and then my hand started to hurt as I got older. So I just kind of like, I got to figure out a better way here. And I'm like, I got to get into the 21st century. So I converted what I did by hand with that old NCAA scorebook to the computer and basically came up with that computer program. I still type everything in. And so like committing it, writing to memory, helping like so many others have talked about, if I do the physical act of typing it in, it's the same thing as writing. It helps me commit to memory. And I come up with a suitable, similar chart for football as well, where I have, the outlines of the positions involved depending on the formation of the offense or the formation of the defense, and literally type things in. And same as writing the letters, it helps me commit that information to memory. So whether it's typing, whether it's writing, I'm just, hey, these fingers don't work as fast as they used to. So I'm trying to help myself out here a little bit.
Hey, John Rooke, I'm old school. I don't know if you can really see that, but I do a hand-printed version of what you do, very similar. But, I mean, from Sister Catherine Williams' class way back in the day, I mean, write it all down. Come on, man. You got to write it down.
Any bruises on those knuckles, Dave?
No, hey, colored chart, you write it down, it goes right in there more often than not, because I'd hate to misstroke. And I did go computer for a while. My wife set up pretty much, John, your board. But I just felt so much better writing it down, after I talked to the coaches, watch the tape, watch the film, then I write it down. And as Mark was talking, and a few other guys were talking about, boom, there it is.
I think this would be an excellent opportunity for the king of the manila folder to show us one of his Miami Heat cards.
Oh, you use the manila folders? That's where I go in basketball. Yes, sir.
Me too.
Yes. Listen, I'll tell you, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 7-8 years ago, I hooked up with Brian Friedman, who is responsible for the company Broadcaster's Edge. Mm-hmm. And what he does is take whatever your preparation style, and he transfers it to his computer template. He's tied into Stats Inc. So in his database, there's every player in the NBA, height, weight, years in the NBA, what college they went to. That's that's in the database. Their career statistics in the database. When I update statistics, to me, the biggest waste of time for me would be to take 15 players on each side and to put in what they did in the last game and what their points per game, rebounds per game, field goal percentage, the basic stats, to just enter that from stat sheet to my board or to my computer program. Just that time alone, I'm reinvesting in other ways. And with Broadcaster's Edge, at the press of a button, it takes about a minute and a half for everybody's stats in the league, team stats, individual stats, to load up. It gives me time to do other things. I pride myself on my prep. This is the front of my last board. What I do the front of my boards before the season starts. When the NBA schedule comes out, the first thing I do is I make the front cover of my board, and it's the games that night. Now, I'll put in just the records, or if they're on a winning streak, But just by doing that every game day, first of all, I don't want to have to, this takes 15, 20 minutes to just 15 minutes maybe to put the game, the date, the arena, the games of that night. And then I leave space here for standings or other notes, series notes here. But I don't want to have to take 15, 20 minutes to line this up. So I do that in the preseason or before the season begins. And this is my monstrosity I'm in. And when people see it, they're like worried about my sanity or my mental health. But listen, here's what I believe. The two disciplines involved is the discipline to be 100% prepared for every game you do. The greater discipline is what Mark talked about earlier, to not feel compelled to use it. Overuse by a play-by-play guy or a producer is as bad as being underprepared. So I think those are the two disciplines. And the board is just part of it, because the game tells us what to talk about, not your preparation. So I think we serve the game, and you gotta do that. You can't let your prep lead you. The game has to lead you.
Yep.
Questions? I know there are people who have questions. Feel free. Unmute and fire away. Who's got a truck backing up outside?
And
I
then
think
New
that's,
York. New York. What else is new?
Anybody have any thoughts on how quickly we're going to get back to fans in the stands?
I think at least in our league, at the earliest next season, at the earliest. And that's not any inside knowledge. That's just from talking to people at the league office, guys who work for different teams. The NBA was at the forefront of shutting down to begin with, and I think they'll be at the forefront of exercising caution. It's a pretty prudent group. So whenever it is, it won't be anytime soon. I think we can all agree on that.
You know what, guys? I think Adam Silver and the NBA, it was March 11th. We were doing a game that night, found out midway through the game that the league was being suspended at the end of that game. In 32 years with the Heat and over 40 years of doing this, I don't ever remember such a surreal set of circumstances. But I feel proud of what Adam Silver did and what the NBA did, because they were the first professional sports league, and I think brought attention to this that wasn't there before. And listen, I know they want to at least have the playoffs for this past season, whether it's in July or August. I think there's a chance of that happening at neutral sites without fans. And whether that happens or not, Mark and everybody, I have a feeling that next season is not going to start until Christmas time or January 1st, when hopefully there will be fans back in the stands. But I think because of that, whether we finish the season late in the summer or not, I have a feeling the next NBA season might not start till 2021 or thereabouts.
Yeah, I think that might be a pretty prudent guess, as I said. And I echo everything Eric said, and I'm biased. I've been in this league for 32 years, and I've seen a lot of things happen. And, Dave's in baseball. A lot of you guys are in college football and basketball, and so you have different perspectives. We all have our biases. But I've always been really proud with the way the NBA has conducted its business. Of course, they've made mistakes and they've screwed up from time to time. But they're generally pretty progressive. And as Eric pointed out, the first one to take a step towards shutting things down. And I think it was the responsible thing to do. And I think the fact that they did it encouraged others to follow course.
There's no question. I don't think baseball moves baseball wasn't going to move first. As soon as Adam pulled the plug, man, we got word, hey, everybody bug out, go home.
I think Dave, I think the bigger picture is that I think the pro sports, no matter how it comes together, whether it's NBA, baseball, the NHL, for example, the NFL, I think the pro game will have to start in some fashion before the college game will. The college game is a bigger evolved piece now. It's gotten to a point where conferences and schools are, there's such a pyramid kind of here. I've been told that states could constitute the reopening. No college team wants to play without fans. I mean, whether it's Waco, Blacksburg, I see JD on here, Mobile. I mean, wherever the situation is, these are community events. They're tied to economic renewal. And college sports, I mean, Bob knows in Boise, college football is an event. It's not just an athletic event. It's an event for Boise. And that's going to be the trick there. They're going to have to play with fans. You can't ask the University of Georgia to play Alabama the third week in September with a 103,000 seat stadium and nobody's sitting in it. That doesn't work. The NBA and the NFL and Major League Baseball can lead America back to live sports. And college football, whether it's played mid-October, mid-November, December, or in 2021, will be played because I think economically it has to be played for the revitalization of those communities and those states in many respects.
Yep.
And
I think
college football is just different across the country. It's a different level across the country, but it's all tied to one thing, and that's the economic renewal of those areas, whether it's in LA, San Francisco, or Boise or Waco.
I think the biggest thing is going to be if some of the members of the league, based on the way their communities have come back to what they're doing, if some in the league can play and some can't, I think it's going to be a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think in the college game, the biggest change is going to be, and I hate to use the term non-revenue sports, but that's the reality of where it is. I think you're going to see mass scheduling changes in the way non-revenue sports are handled for the next 5 to 10 years because of the expenses. I mean, I've already had 2 baseball coaches tell me that they had plans to play a 2 time zone trip next year, and they're gone. Those trips are gone. They're going to reset and play somebody that they can get on a bus and go to. My son works at an Atlantic Sun school as a manager on the basketball team. They're supposed to go to Creighton and Iowa State next year. And unless Creighton and Iowa State pay for their travel, they're not going.
Yep.
I mean, I think that's where college athletics could really feel bad if no football gets played. It's going to be a real issue.
You're going to see the elimination of a number of non-revenue sports. This is already starting to happen in the sport that I cover, soccer, and already even more pressure on sports like wrestling. Not just cutting them back, but elimination, and that's really scary.
Pat Riley always refers to the NBA and sports as the toy department of human affairs. And even though it's all of our livelihoods, it's more than our hobby and our passion, it's our livelihood. But really, it's small in comparison to what our country is dealing with right now. And I think now, as we're seeing some states or part like Florida, part of the state is open. South Florida is not. Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County are still closed. But as states begin to reopen, are we going to see, a relapse and more people getting sick? So I think as we start to see this, then the fall is going to become more apparent to us. But I still think listen, will things return to normal? I hope so, but it's going to be a slow and gradual return to normal. We got a long road ahead of us before we get back to doing the things, whether it's professionally or just personally, that we took for granted before. So it's funny, fans asking you questions. I had one Twitter question saying, of all the games you've ever done in 32 years with the Heat, what's your favorite game? And I wrote him back, the next one. And to me, it was the best answer I could give at this time.
Yeah, good answer.
Let me switch back to actually, Mark, you touched on a little bit that nobody wants to hear what our problems are, but as an organization that advocates for sports media, is there a way for us to help in, say, seating in arenas? Because it is important that we all are able to see what we're talking about. And I know the professional leagues have organized groups of NBA broadcasters or NHL broadcasters. Is there a way for us to help in that realm at all?
There's definitely a way. There's definitely a way, Dave. For instance, I mean, because I know that the NBA has shifted, as Mark was talking earlier, Eric talking earlier about how those guys have been moved up in the stands because they sell so many of the floor seats now. And I think we see in the college game that so many schools are selling those floor seats as well and taking that space away from the media. In the Big East in particular, I can tell you that when the league redeveloped itself, reformatted itself back in 2013, 2014, they initially bumped us upstairs at Madison Square Garden, where the NBA was located. And it was miserable because you could not get the feel, you couldn't get the rah-rah that the college game typically gives you over some other sports. And so as a broadcast entity, as a group of broadcasters, we went to the league office and we said, look, we really appreciate being put down on the floor. And here, let me tell you why. Not only did that help convince them, but when you also have, 50 guys from the city of New York, who are credentialed, and they're all right on the front row, and nobody shows up for that Providence Butler game, those are open seats. I said, how about, letting the broadcasters get to those open seats, and we'll, switch positions back. And we did a fair amount of lobbying, and it worked. So I would tell you that if you're solid together in terms of where you think you should be, and that you're dealing from a fair perspective when it comes to dealing with the rest of the media, then I think you can band together and can have an effect. And at least we were able to effectuate a little bit of positive change there and get back down on the floor.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you can have some impact at the college level. In the NBA, that ship has sailed. We tried that, and it's all about the money. And most of us have come to grips with it. The one thing, and it all depends on the franchise you work for. In Indianapolis, when they decided to move us up off the floor, they didn't ask me if it was okay, but they did ask me and my engineer, hey, we're going to move you up. Can you help us? Can you tell us how? And we got a great setup in Indianapolis. Yeah. Other places don't give a damn. Boston's a joke. New York's a joke. Orlando, you may as well be on the surface of the moon. And so you can make your feelings and your concerns felt, but at our level, and I only speak for the NBA, I don't know about baseball and hockey and football. Those are all different animals. But in the NBA, you're at the mercy of your own franchise in terms of the setup. If you've got a good one, they'll listen to you. But getting back down on the floor is not going to happen.
If I could just jump in on that, Mark. In Miami, we have one of the best setups in the league. Radio is upstairs, okay? But TV, we are on the floor. And here's more important than being on the floor. What side of the court are you on? If you are on the floor sitting near your bench and you're on the, then being on the floor gets diminished because a good 50 to 70% of the time, you're going to have your coach standing in front of you and you're going to have to watch the monitor instead of watching the court. So listen, if I had my choice, I'd always pick the court. But there are certain locations like in Los Angeles where you're in a mid-level box, it's fine. And you lose that ability to talk to the officials, and that's about it. Because sometimes lifted off the court a little bit, and again, I'd rather be on the court, but when you're off the court, you never have to worry about the coach screening you out, and you have almost not as high up as football, but a little bit overall better perspective looking down at the game. So a lot of guys waste a lot of time, frustration, and energy complaining about it, lobbying about it, talking. We spend more wasted time at NBA broadcast meetings on this subject and almost never talk about preparation things or other things that could help us all. So it's a lot of wasted time and energy. You got to make the best of whatever your location is.
And one other thing, Eric, along those same lines, and I hope this isn't beating a dead horse. Dave made this point earlier and others have amplified on it. It's fine for us to sit here in this forum and bitch about it. Never, ever, and I don't mean to lecture, but you guys know this, never, ever mention it on the air. The guy listening or watching doesn't give a damn if you can't see past your coach. The only time I ever mention it is if I can't see something and I'm trying to explain it, I may mention here in New York, we're a little higher and I can't quite see what's going on down there. We'll do the best we can. Otherwise, because the guy who's watching and listening would be glad to sit there and get paid.
Right.
I'm lecturing you guys. You all know this, but I think it's a really critical point.
I'm glad you brought that up, Mark. I think it's hugely important. You can't do anything about your circumstances or your situation, and the people who are taking the time out of their day to watch you or listen to you, they don't care. So go on with it.
Yeah.
Mark, I've got
Neil's question about Remy broadcast and doing games out of studios. The guy at home doesn't know you're not on site. Play it out. Play the game out. I know you feel like you're telling a lie or selling smoke, but the bottom line is you're still doing the game.
He's digging a ditch for a living, I'll tell you that.
Wes, do you think the NFL is going to start on time?
No, I don't. I don't think the NFL is going to start on time. I think they're going to play because I think they realized last week. And look, they have not. And you guys know this. I mean, they've staged free agency, the draft, everything else. They're a monster battleship that's going to run the harbor until they get 96 hours before they play to say no, we're not going to play. But I think they're going to play. I'm not sure they're going to play in their stadiums. I think they may have to play, some sort of regional neutral thing, much like I've kind of heard the variety of things about the NBA going to, certain places and congregating or whatever the case may be. I got to be honest, guys. I think pro sports, and I said this a minute ago, I think the NBA, the NFL, baseball, hockey, if they can do it, they're going to lead the way back. I just think that smaller – I mean, Mark, you and Eric know, Dave knows this, the ability to travel those pro teams is a lot easier than traveling any college football team or any NFL football team for sure. And once they can find out the way that happens, then that allows the NFL. I think the NFL is going to play. Will I be there to do the game? I got no damn idea. I think there's a better chance I'm not there to do it when they play than whether or not they play.
Yeah.
I can see that baseball 3 division, 10-team geographical alignment to what you were talking about, Wes. That has a really good chance. There's a whole bunch of variables that they got to put together and a whole bunch of things on a punch list. But if they can do that, and I stay west with the Dodgers, the Angels, et cetera. So geographically, I mean, it could work out well because if California does eventually open up, they got enough ballparks. You got Arizona, the Dome. We have a roof in Seattle. Houston and Dallas both have roofs, domes. Could be good to go. So, but again, for my money, until Dr. Fauci rings that all clear siren, I'm not going to feel real comfortable about this, to be honest with you.
I got to be honest with you. I think that's one of the things that is really going to be interesting about this is to see how this goes. I mean, Eric, you and Mark have probably heard the whole Vegas alignment of T-Mobile, Thomas and Mack, MGM, and take everybody there. I've heard MLS is talking about going to Bradenton, Florida, and taking 10 franchises to Florida. I mean, it's so wild, but here's the deal. They have to play. And we all need them to play. We all need them to play for the economics of what it is that goes on in our lives. But they're part of the spiritual renewal of the country in a weird way too. And that's the other aspect of it that I think that, they don't want to be overzealous, to Mark's point. And I think, Eric, you're right, it's a slow roll, but I can tell you this, there are a lot of people on the collegiate level watching what the pros are going to do. A lot of people.
In the NBA now, Orlando has become a site that they're talking about at the Disney Sports Complex. So that's a possibility. But listen, I'm not going to get political on anybody here, but that testing issue, until that's resolved and straightened out, come on, what are we even talking about? And they better come up with another test, because how many times do you think an NBA player is going to want to get that thing poked up his nose to his brain? How many times they're going to have to keep testing? So they better have another way to do the testing, because I know guys are not going to want to submit to that over and over again.
Well, and the other thing I would add is we're going to get a chance to watch racing in the PGA Tour, and that's going to help a lot of us, because you get the PGA Tour and NASCAR back out there even without fans. And apparently they're going to go through – Monahan's talking about doing 2 or 3 tests during the course of that tournament week in order to get those guys to make sure they're safe. And if that's the case, and they're going to do it, by the way, without the swing coaches, the think coaches, they're going to be very bare bones on the PGA Tour. Hell, half those managers and agents aren't going to know what to do with themselves if they can't go stand on the range with phones and, Bluetooth and everything.
Old school.
We have about 3 minutes left before the window closes, so let me just thank everybody for participating today, especially our presenters. Thank you for your time and your expertise. And Coach Durham, as always, thank you. And we're gonna try to do one of these a week, different topics. If you guys have any topics you'd like us to cover, you can email me at dgorin@nationalsportsmedia.org. And And if you just want to pop in and participate, we can fit up to 100. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Dave.
And I'll leave the window open for you guys.
Cocktail hour.
to
Jordan, you
chat.
could do a cocktail hour if you wanted to.
I like that. I like that.
A virtual cocktail hour that you would sponsor as usual.
Hey, the Milwaukee Brewers did a virtual cocktail party last week at 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock somewhere last week.
With Euchre, I bet that was good.
You know it was. You know it was.
You know, we talked about Remy's, and I wanted to put together one of these specifically on Remy's for people who have never done them and people who have. So if you guys have any suggestions on people we should include on that, let me know as well.
Good idea. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all.
Be well, everyone.
Stay safe.
Mark Boyle, hope to see you in the first round of the playoffs.
Yeah, that'd be good.